here to help us all try and make sense of what we just heard is a special edition of our Front Bench. We've got Scott Reid here. He's a CTV News political commentator, as well as former communications director to Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin. Former interim Conservative leader Anna Ambrose is with us. She's the deputy chairwoman of TD Securities. And our CTV News political analyst and former leader of the NDP, Tom Mulcair, is here too. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thanks for listening to that press conference. Maybe that you know something I don't, Scott, but as more information comes in and we're trying to figure out, it seems like we may have certainly escaped the worst of what he plans to do to other countries. I don't know.
Well, let's hope so, but that still leaves us in a very unwelcome position. And look, imagine the position of Premier Ford. Imagine the position of the Prime Minister. Imagine if you're a plant worker wondering whether or not you're going to have a job in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and listening to that carnival of confusion and economic illiteracy. I mean, it is absolutely unclear what's going to happen, to whom, when, at what rate. So does this mean we only have a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, or a 35%? Does it mean that we only have a 25% tariff on our auto industry, or is it going to be 35%, or is it going to be something much less than 25%? Who knows? These are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs on the line, people's lives and livelihoods. And, this guy's up there acting like he's running a church bingo, holding up placards and stunts. And, you have to ask yourself, how can you possibly engage with this White House? And now the phone lines are going to be clogged because every single country that's up on his Bristol board there is going to be trying to reach to understand exactly what's the calculation that takes me to 34% if I'm China, or 77%, or whatever the heck it is. So it's a complete soup of confusion, and confusion creates uncertainty, and that creates economic vulnerability.
Yeah, there's definitely no taking the uncertainty away. That I can attest to very much. So, Rana, I mean, we're so focused on what this means for Canada, but we're also part of a globally integrated economy to a certain degree. When I look at the possibility of a 34 or 44% tariff on everything China makes that goes into the United States, or another 20% on all of the EU, like that in and of itself will have massive consequences.
I mean, I think it has a lot more consequences for China and the EU than it does for us today. I think today we have to reflect on what's in front of us. What we heard from Trump is about his tariff plan and his tax cut plan. On the reciprocal tariff front, Canada and Mexico are not included in that, and we have argued for months why we shouldn't be targeted by the U.S. for these unjustified tariffs. And we are not being targeted by reciprocal tariffs, at least not to the extent of other countries. And let's hope that this is some type of justification and understanding and recognition that Canada and the U.S. and Mexico have an integrated economy, and a big part of our economies are already today tariff-free. Interestingly, I found, if you read the document, I just perused it really quickly, he talks about Lutnick, he talks about the USMCA not having delivered what it should have delivered to date. And so then invoking the National Security Clause to then start to talk about what he wants to do with USMCA, which is to apply 25% tariffs on all foreign-owned or foreign-made vehicles. He mentions then Korea, Japan, India. He never mentions Canada or Mexico. But if you read between the lines, what he does say is what he said last week. Inasmuch as if you're compliant with the USMCA and a car is made in Mexico or Canada, they're going to add up how many parts are not American made, and then there might be a tariff applied to those pieces of the car. It's very complicated. I think that's where the uncertainty comes in. How is this really going to affect different cars made in Mexico and Canada with the Mexican and Canadian materials? We don't have clarity on that, but it is falling under this larger, I assume, negotiation tactic around the USMCA. And I found it interesting because that's where we could read clearly where he's coming at us. He's coming at us on autos. And he's saying, I want more parts in the North American-made vehicle made by Americans in America. He did this in the last round of negotiations. He wants more now. That's the threat. That's the threat to the auto sector. So what do we do? And then he mentions, which was almost bizarre, he's talking about tariffs on the entire globe. and he picks out supply management and the dairy sector, which people around the world must have watching this speech coming from the Rose Garden thinking, what's with Canada's dairy sector? Why is he targeting this, something we've never heard of? Well, we've all heard of it because the dairy sector and supply management is one of the biggest irritants in every trade negotiation that Canada has embarked on in the last several decades since it's come into being. So we know now he's coming after dairy again, which he came after last time. We managed to increase the amount of dairy exclusion for the United States, and we compensated our dairy farmers. I think it was $2 billion to do that. But obviously he's coming after that again. So I think what Pierre said this morning, we've got to get to the negotiating table. After the election, that has got to be the first thing we do, is sit down with Mexico and the United States and start hammering out what this actually looks like.
Well, they're in again, and Tom reminds us, like, there's a federal election going on, right? And referring to Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party's comments, which I know maybe, people will say are, there's differences in delivery and in the framing, but ultimately Mark Carney last week also said that this was the start of negotiations, not per se of USMCA, but the idea that clearly Trump is using the tool of tariffs, in his view, to start renegotiating the trade relationship between Canada and the United States. Seems like all federal leaders seem to have that impression at this point. It does largely, to Rana and Scott's point, there's tons of upheaval around the world based on what's being announced, but I can't help but have the sense like we were expecting something even worse than already exists, and it doesn't seem like that's the case from Canada. There's additional reports out now saying that we will even get an exemption from that baseline 10% tariff based on the presence of USMCA.
Well, how can it be otherwise, Vashi? Because if the whole idea is to renegotiate the USMCA, then they have to show some sign of good faith in applying the deal that Trump signed himself. It's not as if he can say that it's Joe Biden's fault. It's Donald J. Trump who held up the signed copy with Mexico and Canada and saying this had just replaced what he had described as the worst trade deal in the history of the United States, because he never exaggerates on anything, and that was the NAFTA. So it was replaced by this one, and all of a sudden, I'm listening to Lutnick carefully when he says, well, it didn't produce the results we wanted, which is an indication you want to negotiate. But it's also an indication that he's leaving the door open to maybe slipping something in there that would be completely against that trade deal. So if this means that we're heading back to the negotiating table, that's what Carney's been signaling. Francois Legault, to give one provincial premier, is on side. And what's most distressing here is to listen to the premier of the province that produces the most automobiles, Doug Ford, who's been just such a stalwart. He deserves to be recognized for the very positive role he's played. He was standing there in front of the microphones and just simply saying, we don't know. And how is it possible that you get through the 1 hour diatribe in the Rose Garden? I listened to every second of it, as we all did, and saying, but we don't know. And it's the uncertainty that is the basic problem in all of this. Everybody looks at Mr. Trump goes on and on about, oh, there's all these companies coming in. There are no deals being made right now. Nobody is deciding. Nobody's board of directors is going to tell them that they can go ahead because there is so much uncertainty. If this is an indication that at least that trading partnership, Canada-U.S. Mexico, is going to be allowed to continue in some form, that's good. But you also have to listen to what Trump says when he talks. He kept referring to kept calling it a VAT. That's the value-added tax, the VAT, which is something that we have, something that Europeans have on a much higher level. He's lumping that in. He says tariffs and these things. So we've got to keep an eye on that, because then that goes right at the heart of our ability to have our own fiscal and revenue system. That's something that was never contemplated, and I think that it's going to be on the table in the next round of negotiations.
The list of things to keep our eyes on is a mile long at this point. Thank you all for listening to that press conference with us and your analysis this evening. I appreciate it. Scott Reed, Rana Ambrose, and Tom Mulcair.